Hi, everybody. I'm PJ Kwong for SGS Live. And in today's session, we're going to be talking about sustainable shipping and focusing on the environmental issues affecting the industry and testing around them. SGS Marine Services, including inspection, verification, and auditing, ensures the effectiveness and safety of your marine supply and logistics chain. The marine industry is subject to a range of standards, regulations, and logistical complexities. As a result, we offer a range of marine services to support your decision making on crucial plant and terminal operations, or PTO, helping improve your business strategy for imports and exports. The expert advice of our experienced marine transportation teams allows you to focus on the key elements of your core business while we investigate your marine operations. This is going to be a fascinating conversation. And today I am joined by three SGS experts. First up is retired U.S. Coast Guard and the Manager of Sales and Customer Relations in SGS Industries and Environment, Robert Goldring. Welcome, Bob.
Good morning from beautiful New York, PJ. So happy to join you today.
So happy to have you. Next up, we are also joined by Dr. Lisa Drake, the SGS Americas Manager for Marine Field Services and Monitoring. Welcome, Lisa.
Good morning, PJ. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us. Okay, last but not least, I would like to welcome Daniel Lodato, General Manager, NAM, Marine Field Services and Monitoring. Welcome, Dan.
Well,
I think Dan will be
thanks,
on
PJ.
mute.
I'm glad to
There
be
we
here.
go.
Hi,
Love
I'm
it.
here.
Wonderful. I love technology and we are excited and ready to go. Okay, Bob, I'm going to start with you. Can you please tell me about shipboard environmental services and why we need them?
I can, PJ. And let me say that's a great question because we get asked that quite a bit. So let me start off by saying that there's always been a need for environmental maritime compliance, but it wasn't until the beginning of this century that marine environmental compliance started increasing through various regulatory organization. And that's actually when the first SGS environmental compliance event started and this sector was formed. So we've been doing it since then. We did have something called MARPOL, which simply stands for Marine Pollution Regulations. That came into effect about 50 years ago, but we've never seen such an increase in concern for the maritime environmental compliance as we have in the past 20 years.
So when we're talking compliance, do you mean like seat belts is a form of compliance? Like what is compliance?
Yes, and compliance, it's a hard word to swallow. As you say, you have to wear your seatbelt. That's compliance. You have to go 65 miles per hour on a United States highway in some locations. That's compliance. But why do we do it? Let's get to that question. So while the marine sector of SGS is largely based on regulatory compliance, the reason why we're doing these events, I would sum it up as 4 words: the survival of Earth and its oceans. Simply put, PJ, our oceans support life, and without them, we cannot really exist. And this wonderful circle of life that we have is not possible. You know, the ocean produces over half of the world's oxygen and absorbs 50 times more carbon dioxide than our atmosphere.
I had no idea.
Yeah. So approximately 60,000 ships and their owners buy compliance with these regulations, and we're going to talk about the regulations today, help reduce the burden that's placed on our oceans. So this includes the transfer of invasive species, okay? It also helps reduce pressure on the survival of all marine life, including global fish stocks that feed the world. And of course, as we probably all know, the ocean has a big part in regulating climate. So that really sums up why we're doing this work and why it's supported by important regulations from organizations like the U.S. Coast Guard and the International Maritime Organization, or the I IMO. Always get that word mixed up.
It's morning. It's fine.
Yeah.
So you mentioned something that sort of piqued my interest, and that is the International Maritime Organization. So, Bob, what exactly is that, and what do they do?
Well, we actually have someone on our broadcast, Dr. Lisa Drake, who's actually attended these meetings. So, Lisa, do you want to take that about the IMO?
Sure, Bob. The,
Great.
Inter- the International Maritime Organization, the IMO, is a specialized part of the United Nations, and its headquarters are in London. It's responsible for the safety and security of shipping, as well as marine and atmospheric pollution, which is what we're talking about today. As part of the UN, it has member countries and stakeholders, and it works by consensus. Now, if we think about those 60,000 ships Bob was talking about sailing from country to country, the global economy will run much smoother if regulations are consistent across countries. So the idea is the IMO takes a global approach and prevents a patchwork quilt of different regulations around the world.
Okay, I get it. Speaking of global, we always have a global audience, and I always try and come up with a little trivia question. So that's what we're going to take a look at now. Now, Bob, Lisa, and Dan, obviously you can't answer because you are experts. But here is our question for today. I'd like to know how many metric tons of cargo were shipped globally in 2020. Answer number one, 1.85 billion metric tons. Answer number two, 975 million metric tons. And answer number three, 1.2 billion metric tons. So if you want to play along, please put your answers in the chat window below. But what do you think about that question? So metric tons of cargo shipped globally in 2020. So Bob, Lisa, and Dan, I'm going to ask you guys what you think our audience is going to answer before we reveal the real answer. So the answers again are 1.85 billion metric tons, 975 million metric tons, or 1.2 billion metric tons. What do you guys think our audience is going to answer? Bob, I'm going to start with you.
I would have to say, because we've had so much experience with the global shipping and we've seen effects, I would say the most, which is, I guess, number one.
Okay.
That's what I predict. I don't know.
Lisa or Dan, what do you guys think?
Well, I don't know what the audience will say, but it's going to be a big number since approximately 90% of goods are moved by ships at some point. So
wow.
Right?
Wow, that is amazing. Dan, anything to add before I reveal the answer?
The highest number, I think, number one.
Oh, okay. The answer is, in fact, lots of people think it's number three, and that is 1.2 billion metric tons. But the actual answer is 1.85 billion metric tons of cargo that was shipped in 2020. Now, listen, math is not my strong point, but depending on the size of the cargo, unit thing, that comes out to, just to put it into kind of perspective, at least 66 million cargo containers. Can you imagine? Huh, that's a lot.
A lot.
A lot. Okay, we're going to go back to our discussion. And I'm going to turn my attention to you, Dan. We've been talking, or I've heard lots about, not we've been talking about it yet, but about ballast water in ships and invasive species. What are we talking about? And are there examples of invasive species that come to mind?
Sure. Ballast water is water that's loaded to a ship to maintain the ship's stability. It's taken up in one location and can be discharged in another location, and it can carry organisms along with it. Most organisms can die on the voyage because they can't survive in the tanks without any sunlight. But some organisms can survive. They can be discharged in a new location, and they can grow like weeds. These are what we refer to as invasive species, which can cause great economic and environmental harm. An example of an invasive species is the zebra mussel. This is a small freshwater mussel native to Eastern Europe that is about the size of your fingernail, and it has a striped shell from which it gets its name. It was accidentally introduced to the Great Lakes in North America in the 1980s, And it has since spread throughout the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River, and remains a problem to this day. The species can grow in a kind of concentrated blanket, and it can carpet areas. Densities have been recorded upward of 100,000 zebra mussels in a square meter.
Wow.
And yeah, it's very concentrated, and they can actually encrust things like boat engines, cooling pipes, or even other animals. The zebra mussel is an ecological and economic issue today, like I mentioned. In fact, it's estimated that the United States in the next decade will spend $3.1 billion managing this issue. The intention of the regulation is to prevent such infestations. And the regulations do that by placing very low limits on the number of organisms that can be discharged in ships' ballast water.
So this is a huge problem because obviously the invasive species, when they're not native to an area, they are unchallenged. So I could see where that is a huge problem. So Dan, further to your point, what are ships doing to meet those very low limits?
So many ships will install a ballast water management system. And what this is basically a mini water treatment plant that's installed onto the ship that treats the ballast water when it's loaded. These plants will borrow technology from land-based applications for drinking water treatment. So think filtration, UV light, or chemical injection. It might sound simple to simply adapt this land-based technology for a shipboard application, but it's actually quite challenging because there are electrical power concerns. The systems need to not shake apart with the constant vibration of the ocean. And they also need to be shoehorned into engine rooms that are not otherwise designed to accommodate extra equipment.
Got to tell you, none of this sounds simple. None of it. So Lisa, along those same lines, if I were a ship owner or a regulator, how could I be sure that this was working?
Yeah, good question. In general, when equipment's installed on a ship, it's tested to make sure it works properly and it's safe. This is called commissioning testing. As of June 1st of this year, biological testing is also required to determine if those low limits on the concentrations of organisms in ballast water have been met. Now, this is a bit tricky because the limits are so low. So you have to filter a relatively big volume of water to have statistical confidence in the results. And you're probably wondering just how big those samples of water should be. And the answer is 1 to 3 cubic meters. To put that into perspective, 3 cubic meters is about the size of a hot tub. So it takes some time to filter, about an hour. And to do this, testing organizations use specialized portable samplers to filter this relatively big volume of water.
Well, I just knew that this was going to be a fascinating conversation. And as I mentioned, our SGS Lives are global each and every time. So we're going to take a quick look at the comments to see who has joined us today and from where. I see Pakistan represented, Indonesia, Romania, India. Oh my goodness, I told you. Everywhere, Colombia. So all of the continents end up being represented, and we want to wish you all a big, warm welcome. And thank you for joining us today. And if you are just joining us, we are in the midst of a fascinating conversation about sustainable shipping and the impacts on the environment. And I'm talking to my SGS marine experts, Bob Goldring, Lisa Drake, and Dan Lodato. And don't forget, there's going to be a Q&A at the end of this interview portion. If you want to leave us a comment or a question, please do so in the chat below. But right now, we're going to get back to our conversation. So Dan, this one's for you. From the ship owner's perspective, what is needed to prepare for the commissioning testing that Lisa was just talking about?
Really good question, PJ. We get requests every week for this type of testing all around the world. Some things that come to mind that you want to think about when planning an event for commissioning is to allow adequate time to prepare. The SGS team, we need to have some interaction to collect data about the ballast water management system that's been installed. Things like pipe diameter and flow rate are important to ensure that our sampling device can be connected. And also we can talk through devising a sampling plan. Throughout the planning process, good communication is really vital for a smooth event. There's lots of parties involved with a commissioning event. The owner, operator, the crew, the agent, class, SGS, the shipyard, the manufacturer of the treatment system, and I could go on. So to make sure there's alignment there is really important. And the last thing I think would be to think about this, by definition, these are brand new systems because commissioning is upon a new installation. So it's really important to make sure that the installation was successfully completed and that the system is operated to manufacturer specifications, particularly something called tank holding time. A lot of the systems will require for the water to sit in the tank for a specific duration of time for the treatment to take full effect. And it's really important that that time is satisfied prior to SGS drawing the sample.
So, Lisa, I'm going to talk a little bit about SGS and about testing. I mean, this sounds very complex. Does SGS have lots of experience in this area, or can you speak to that?
Yep, I sure can. Our teams around the world have conducted over 700 commissioning tests in 26 countries. And what's encouraging is that we've seen improvement over time. That is, more ballast water management systems are working like they're intended to work. So when we started testing about 2 years ago, the failure rate was about 20%, and now it's down to about 6%. And
Wow.
yeah, this progress is testament to all the stakeholders that Dan talked about who are involved in the process. And one interesting finding that we've seen is that almost all of the failures are because there are too many organisms in the largest size class of organisms, which are typically tiny crustaceans. And other groups of people doing this type of testing have seen a similar trend. In our experience, the failures seem to be due to dirty tanks and dirty pipes. So the solution is to put in place additional cleaning procedures, ensure that the crew has good training, and have periodic checks.
That statistic really impresses me. 20% down to 6%. I mean, that is quite remarkable. So I'm
Yeah.
going to stick with you for the moment. If
Sure.
part of this work is about getting the word out, are you able to share your results, whatever they may be, with the stakeholders and anybody else?
Yep, that's right. Anonymous data, and that's important, anonymous, are shared in scientific publications. And sometimes they're submitted to the International Maritime Organization if we're working with a government or with other stakeholders. And I should say that I find it personally rewarding to contribute to the scientific and policy discussions in this way.
And for people who don't know, what we have up on the screen is a paper that you co-authored about ballast water. So you are definitely an expert in this field. So I'm going to switch gears for a moment, and I'm going to come back to Bob. So Bob, just in case you thought you were getting a break, you're not. I understand that there have been recent changes in the US regarding ballast water regulations, as well as regulations for all manner of ship discharges. I know we're talking about US regulations, but it's interesting to find out from you what happened to cause these changes.
Okay. Yes, I definitely can answer that. And I'll try and make it as clear as possible.
Okay.
So right now, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and the U.S. Coast Guard regulate ballast water discharged in the United States. What happened in December 2018, the Vessel Incidental Discharge Act, known as VIDA, VIDA, was signed into law. And that is establishing a framework for the regulation of discharges incidental to the normal operation of vessels for approximately 30 categories of discharges. What are incidental discharges? Let me give you some examples so we're clear. It's ballast water, it's bilge water, it's gray water from sinks and showers. So it's discharges like that, incidental. This is a new section of the EPA Clean Water Act. Basically, the EPA sets the standards and the U.S. Coast Guard develops the implementing regulations. So the idea is to simplify the regulatory requirements for ships operating in U.S. waters. Now, the EPA intends to publish the final regulation by November 2023. And then the U.S. Coast Guard has up to 2 years to implement the regulations. So all this means that the current U.S. regulations for annual reporting, EPA Vessel General Permit, will remain in place for the foreseeable future. Yeah, I did want to mention California. Can I do that real fast?
You absolutely can.
Okay,
Please do.
good. So the other thing I wanted to mention, California regulations changed early this year, and people may not be aware, so we want to mention it, that if a ship's ballast water management system is not working, the ship now needs to notify the U.S. Coast Guard as well as the California State Lands Commission. So I hope it was clear to everyone.
It sure was. Thank you so
Good.
much for that. I want to just remind our audience that if you're just joining us, we are speaking with Bob Goldring, Lisa Drake, and Dan Lodato, who are my SGS Marine Services experts. And we're on SGS Live talking about sustainability in shipping and the impact on the environment. Don't forget, we're going to have a quick Q&A at the end of this interview segment. And if you want to ask a question, feel free to leave it for us in the chat below. Now, it's back to our discussion. Okay, Dan, I'm coming back to you. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. Broad strokes. Does this mean that ships are constantly being tested while they are in U.S. waters? And is it only U.S. waters that has this kind of testing?
Okay, good question. Constantly tested, no. The regulations require, depending on what kind of system you have and what kind of ship it is, for testing to occur anywhere between 1 and 4 times annually. No, it's not happening only in the U.S. We do offer the testing in almost every major U.S. port, but the testing can occur anywhere in the world. And so that's why SGS has developed a network of over 330 ports worldwide where we offer this testing. And we're opening new labs all the time. Most recently is our marine lab in Panama, and also laboratory capabilities in Togo and Ghana.
Wow. So truly worldwide, truly global. That's fantastic. And, as Lisa mentioned, there are ships that are going across the world all of the time. So super important. Lisa, I'm a bit curious. Maybe you can answer. Can SGS test for ships' emissions?
Yep, we can. So we've been talking a lot about ballast water testing, but ships emissions is a big topic these days. And we send our experts on board. They have the equipment that's needed, a sample probe to make sure we take a correct sample, the instruments that are required to analyze the gases, and calibration gases to do it. So yep, we can do that as well.
Amazing.
And other services too, of course.
That is fantastic. Okay, we are down to our final question before our Q&A. And although I'm going to come to you first, Lisa, Dan and Bob, you maybe want to be thinking about some answers because I'm going to ask you to follow up as well. So I know we've covered a lot of ground already in this SGS Live, but I want you to take out your crystal ball for a moment, if you don't mind, and fill me in on what you believe is on the horizon for the shipping industry and the environmental rules, and where are we headed, Lisa?
Yeah, good question. A couple of things come immediately to mind. Plastics are really relevant in the news. We've all heard about the huge garbage patch of plastic floating around the Pacific Ocean. Now there's increased focus on what's called microplastics, which are tiny particles generally defined as less than 5 millimeters in size. And there's some interest in measuring microplastics in coastal waters, as well as the ship's gray water that Bob was talking about from sinks and showers. And we're part of a study to develop research questions about how some coatings or paints on ships' hulls might contribute to the release of microplastics. So it's early days, but this is definitely something to watch. And then, of course, greenhouse gases and shipping is a hot topic, no pun intended. Reducing the carbon output of ships has been a really sharp focus at national, regional, and international levels. And it's really an exciting time in the industry because new fuels are being introduced and green shipping routes are being put in place. And I should also say, when we think about greenhouse gases, there's a link between greenhouse gases, invasive species, and biofouling on ships' hulls. And a well-known example of biofouling would be barnacles growing on the outside of ships. More biofouling means more drag on the ship as it moves through water, so more fuel is needed and more greenhouse gases are emitted. So it's important to reduce biofouling by cleaning the hulls or using coatings that reduce fouling, and that decreases the carbon intensity of the ship as well as potential transport of invasive species. So And I'll
Keep
just
going. I love
okay.
it.
I'll just
Yep.
offer one more thing.
Yes.
It seems that there will be a need to have legally defensible data to determine ships' additional compliance with these issues. But we could devote an entire other session to talking about these ideas. So stay tuned.
So, Lisa, here's the thing. I understood, a good chunk of what you were saying. What I'm looking for is to find out whether you are feeling optimistic about the future. I feel optimistic based on what you've said, but you're an expert.
Well, thanks for that. It's a good question, and I am optimistic. These are big global problems, right? But we are putting our heads together and solving them at all scales. So I think, especially with climate change, there's political will to solve these problems. So I'm optimistic.
Okay, Bob and Dan, I'm going to start with you, Bob. What about your crystal ball? How's it working?
Oh, I am very optimistic. We were talking about compliance, right? 30 years ago, people would simply throw garbage out of their car. They complied with the rules, and now we don't have a problem. No one would think about throwing garbage out of their car, right?
Yep.
Okay, so that's the thing. So I think it's great. I'm seeing the people we're dealing with are really behind this going green. In fact, we have some clients that go beyond what they have to do, and they're doing it to prove they're really green. For instance, we have some people doing ballast water testing, really in-depth ballast water testing. They're not required to do that. It's out of the requirements, and they're doing it to show how green they are. So I'm
That's great.
very happy where we are. Yeah.
I bet. What
Yeah.
about you, Dan?
My crystal ball.
I know.
The last 2.5 years, with the global pandemic, I think human health has been a much bigger focus for everybody. Our own health, the health of our families, our colleagues. We've seen that reflected in the shipping industry about the health of the crew and the spaces on board the ships. And we've had some customers approach us with the request that you would typically associate with indoor air quality testing for buildings like theaters or hotels. And we've been able to apply the expertise that SGS has to help solve those problems and provide that data to the customer. And I see that continuing.
That's wonderful. Lots of reason for optimism. We're going to get to our Q&A now. And if you're just joining us, I'm speaking with SGS Marine Services experts, Bob Goldring, Lisa Drake, and Dan Lodato. And we're talking about sustainable shipping, testing, and the environment. Okay, let's get to our first question. What are the consequences for a ship or a ship owner if a ship does not comply with environmental regulations? Dan, maybe this one's for you.
Sure. If this is for the EPA Vessel General permit testing, then retesting is required. And like I mentioned, this can occur at anywhere in the world.
Okay, so if we're talking though, like I see Bob wanting to jump in here, and I do too. So if we're talking about non-compliance in a willful way, are there consequences for that, Bob? Like that's a different thing.
Yeah. I'm glad you had there are. The United States has something called ECP, Environmental Compliance Program. When ships willfully discharge what they should not be discharging, and that's called an illegal discharge, they can get fined by the Department of Justice. In fact, turn the clock back 20 years ago when we started this, 2 years after we got started, I got a call from one of the clients asking for help. They got a fine, and it's a lot of money. So we helped them out with creating a program. We worked with the Department of Justice and the client. So they both would be happy. And they did an environmental compliance program to satisfy what they did that was not correct.
So they've made a mistake, and you were there to sort of help them figure out a strategy to move forward. Is that right?
Exactly. Yes. Yeah.
Wonderful. That's
Yeah.
exactly what we're talking about. Not everybody's going to be perfect. So
Right.
let's meet them where they are. That's
Right.
probably the best way to look at it. Okay.
Exactly, PJ.
Yeah. So, Lisa, this next question is going to be for you. We've been
Mhm.
talking about tests, and it strikes me that it might be important the kinds of tests that you do, who owns the results, and what kind of next steps are dictated or signaled based on the results.
Yep. From our perspective, we're an independent third party tester. So we do testing and we give the results to the client, and then the client owns those results, and then they will submit them to a regulator. So that's how that works. And then if they want us to help interpret the results after that, or bundle data, that's a different thing. But the results are the ownership of the client.
Okay, terrific. Okay, we've got one more question. This has just been the fastest half hour of my life. Okay, Bob, this one is for you. As a
Sure.
wrap up, let's talk specifically about SGS. So, out of curiosity, does SGS perform testing to meet other environmental regulations? And if a ship owner or operator is looking for services, how do they get in touch with SGS?
Okay, sure. We do so many testing events besides what we mentioned, which is part of the VGP, the ballast water, gray water, and OWS and things like that, which I don't think we even touched on, which is the oily water separator.
Next time.
Yeah, next time we'll do that. We actually test potable water on board. We test the air circulation for Legionella, which is Legionella's disease, as you know.
Wow.
Yeah, so a lot of those things we test. We also started a program that's very successful called Crew Well-Being, where we will actually go on board the ship, assess the happiness and general conditions of the crew on board and their physical surroundings. We'll go into the galley, measure temperatures of the food to ensure everything is kept at the specific temperature needed. We'll see about the cleanliness of the ship. And this is great. They also use this before an inspection. If they know public health is coming aboard or something, they'll call us to do this kind of pre-inspection. But a lot of our clients are doing it just because they want to make it better. And that's the great thing about SGS. And that's why I love working for SGS. We want to make things better. To get in touch with us, simply www.sgs.com, and you'll find a little search box, put in ballast water testing, and you'll come up with information, a form to fill in, and we will get right back to you. We're kind of 24/7. The ships are 24/7.
And you know what? We just saw a QR code pop up on the screen, which means if people scan that QR code, they will be taken directly to our site and they can fill out a form and be in touch. You know what? As I said, this has been one of the fastest half hours of my life. I want to thank my guests, Bob Goldring, Lisa Drake, and Dan Lodato, for joining me to talk about sustainable elements in shipping and environmental issues and just everything that we're doing about that. You guys have been fantastic guests.
Thank you, PJ.
Thanks so much, PJ. Thanks,
I look,
everybody.
I look forward to the next one. And thank you to the audience for joining us today on this very engaging. And if you have any more comments or any more questions, feel free to leave them still in the comments in the chat. Scan that QR code and be sure to be in touch with us on our website, sgs.com. For me, I'm PJ Kwong for SGS Live. Thank you for watching. Bye for now.